Welcome back to the Road to 2000s. I am your host, Caleb Denby, and as always, we're going to be making a few pit stops on this Road to 2000. A lot of you may know that I have an upcoming match with Jonathan Schrantz starting April 12th. We just released a little preview for it. It was pretty exciting stuff. If you haven't seen that video yet, I would definitely recommend checking it out. We had a lot of fun doing it. But some of you may know we've been billing the match as, a strong expert level match, but that might be a little bit misleading because actually the average rating I think is somewhere over 2,000, but Jonathan actually hasn't quite gotten there yet. So we're gonna see if we can help him out today, give him a few tips, a few tricks, see what he needs in order to get to that 2,000 level. Because I want this match to be competitive for you guys. So we'll see what we can do here. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be taking a look at some of Jonathan's recent games, some of his games from Lee Chess, one of his games from a recent staff tournament that we had against Tony Rich, who is our club director. So let's start out with one that happened online just a couple weeks ago. Zolpi is actually Jonathan's internet username, so that's why it doesn't say Jonathan down here. But let's take a look at what happened. So Jonathan had black. He was playing Transversalwelle, who is 2100 online, and his opponent played e4. Jonathan recently has been trying out the Sicilian c5 stuff, which is totally fine. Knight f3, e6, and g3, knight c6, bishop g2, g6. So already, this is a little bit abnormal for a lot of openings, right? You usually don't see a player making this many weaknesses, right? Moving both of these pawns to the light squares causes a lot of dark squared weaknesses, which is going to be okay for black in this line specifically, as long as he's careful about it. But that's something to keep in mind in your games, is even when you're allowed to break a certain principle because it follows a line, you just have to be extra cautious to be sure you know what you're doing, because otherwise, making weaknesses like this, it's going to lead to some tactics, to some misfortunes that can go wrong for you later on. But like I said, totally fine for black still. White plays d4. So what do you think white's intending to do here in the next couple turns? What are some features of this position that have already kind of shown themselves? Yeah, so what does white want to do? What's he saying with d4? That's exactly right. He wants to open up the center. So if you take a look, white already has these two pieces developed, right? And black has only developed this knight and moved these three pawns out as well. So a couple things have been made apparent already. White has this slight lead in development. He can, very importantly, castle in just one turn, whereas it's going to take black many turns to castle. And he even has slightly more control over the center, slightly more central space, whereas black is really only fighting for these two squares and maybe the d5 square with this e6 move. So as black, you see all these things happen. And so what do you say to yourself? What do you think you need to do? Should you just continue moving like normal and let white maybe open up the center? Or should you try to shut it down somehow? So yeah, that's an interesting way to try to keep the center closed, is to play this move c4. But the problem is you're kind of giving white even more time to increase his lead, right? So you've made 4 pawn moves now. And white might simply just castle. White might play something like queen e2, gaining more time on this pawn. And yeah, you're going to fall further behind in development. And you've kept the center closed for the moment, but this d5 move might come soon, and that might cause some problems, because then these two pieces are going to be attacked. It's going to be tough to keep things closed. So any other ideas? c4 was interesting, though.
Caleb, were all these games played on Lee Chess?
The 3 of them were.
Was this one?
Yes. Any other ideas for black? So there are two things you can try. You can try to fight back in the center, fight back for some central squares, or you can kind of give up some central squares maybe, but slow down White's plan and have easy development for your pieces. So what are some other ways to try that? Just throw out some moves. They don't have to be right.
You do pawn to b6, and you can get your white bishop out.
Yeah, so pawn b6 is another interesting move, aiming to develop this bishop, right?
And it also protects the
Yeah, and it does add another defender to this pawn. So while this is interesting, it gives this bishop an avenue to develop. It's making slightly more weaknesses, right? You see White's bishop is kind of lurking way behind the scenes here, behind this knight, behind this pawn. But later on, it might cause some issues along this diagonal. And the other thing that you really got to look out for, it doesn't help you get castled any sooner, right? Your king is still going to be stuck in the center for a while. As far as what White might do, he might just, again, ignore this. He might play something like c3, maybe just castle. Maybe, again, this d5 break could be interesting. So some moves I might have thought of would be something like bishop g7 would be kind of interesting, right? You're fighting back in the center, and you're developing a piece. Maybe you're hanging this pawn, but I thought it might be an interesting sacrifice. Maybe later on, you can play queen a5 to try to pick this one up. But then the next thought that occurred to me was, why even allow White to take this pawn like this? Maybe Black can just capture this pawn, right? So if you were to take here, maybe knight takes, and now after bishop g7, you're developing with tempo, right? You're not giving White time to open up the center, and you're developing your pieces as quickly as you can. Another important thing to note here is you've actually traded off a c pawn for a d pawn. So the reason that's important is because center pawns tend to be worth a little bit more than wing pawns, especially if you can push them to advanced squares. So that's another kind of advantage Black would be gaining here. But that's definitely not to say that White would be any worse here in any way. So if I were Black, I might have tried something like c takes d. I might have tried something like bishop g7. The other move Black could try here was actually d5. Which was an interesting way to fight back for some of these central squares that White's trying to take over. Instead, what Black did, what Jonathan did in this case, was d6. So in my opinion, this was kind of missing the point, right? So what do you think is wrong with d6? First of all, you should ask yourself, what is my move doing? So what is d6 trying to accomplish? So he's protecting this pawn, but the pawn was already kind of protected.
Yeah, but not exactly. Not much.
So yeah, it's not doing a whole lot, right? It's giving this bishop a square, which is convenient, which also might be used to help block up the center for a while, but it's simply too slow. So how can you take advantage of this already with the white pieces? This slightly suboptimal move. Yeah, exactly. You just take this pawn, you open it up, and then you trade queens. And now all of Black's pieces are on the back row, and you've got a huge lead in development. So how might you continue here with White now? What do you think the next step would be?
Knight on G to F.
I'm not sure I follow.
Knight from G1 to F3.
Oh yeah, so B1 to C3 in this case. But yeah, you're exactly right. So you're actually already aiming at some awkward squares for Black. So what is White kind of threatening to do next if Black isn't careful, using this knight specifically?
Trying to come
b5.
Yeah, knight b5 coming into c7, attacking these weak squares. So like we said, these two pawn moves, they didn't actually weaken the queen side so much, but they did make a lot of weaknesses all around Black's camp, the way Black has played this entire opening. So because Black is underdeveloped and he has all these weaknesses, White can already kind of aim for some nasty stuff. So this would have been nice to see from White. White actually went a different path and played knight to c3 first. And Jonathan, again, kind of needed to realize that things were going kind of insane, like really wrong for him already. Instead, he just kind of played the slightly optimistic bishop g7. And now White did take this opportunity to play the right move, d takes c5, d c5, queen d8, knight d8. And already we can see knight b5 is threatened. White has 3 pieces developed. Black has 1 piece developed, and his king is stuck in the center. So we saw knight b5 from white. And now black tried king to f8 to save the material. White simply continued with bishop f4, a very strong move. Again, just developing your last piece and creating more threats. So this game has already, black is already completely losing. So the really key mistake was this move d6 and the second move bishop g7. So the lesson I kind of want to take out of this game, which we're going to keep going through it and see how it ended up, because he had a lot of chances to come back. Well, maybe not a lot, but some. But the lesson to take away was when you're unfamiliar with the opening and you noticed you're kind of breaking some principles, right? So the first thing you do when you're unfamiliar with an opening is you want to fall back on principles. And so since black didn't do that here, he had to be very cautious, very aware of what was going on, and needed to really stay alert and realize he might already be in serious trouble. He might already need to do something kind of drastic. With that being said, the game's not over yet. Jonathan went for a6, giving his rook the key a7 square after knight c7. Of course, that's where all rooks belong, is stuck on a7 behind 2 pawns. We saw castles, queenside from white. Another strong move, getting another piece into the game. Jonathan played knight c6 to save his knight. We saw bishop d6 check, knight g to e7. And now bishop takes c5. So white has already kind of won a pawn using his well-placed pieces. We saw b6 from black. And now what do you think white should do here after b6? b6 was actually a nice try. So yeah, your first instinct is to just take it, right? But maybe black has some tricks up his sleeve if you take on b6. What do you think black might try?
Rook b7 fortune.
Yeah, rook b7, attacking both of these pieces. And so that's something to be aware of. So I've talked about this in a previous lecture, but tactics show up when there are loose pieces, when there are undefended pieces. And so definitely these 2 pieces are loose and underdefended. So after something like bishop b6, we would see rook b7. And now there's really no way to save both of these pieces. You might try knight to a8, but now is there anything for black here? Knight a8's obviously not a pleasant move to play. Well, rook b8 is actually better than repeating. You came from a7, right? And now you've gone to b8. So this is attacking both pieces, and now there is no way to defend both of them. You can try something like e5, trying to open up this diagonal, but it's simply not in time. Black can just capture this knight. And of course, if knight back to c7, this bishop is now hanging. That's the key difference. So because of that, what should white play after b6? It's a very direct move. It's not very tricky at all. It's just defending the knight and the bishop.
Bishop takes knight check.
Bishop takes knight is another interesting try. The problem is this knight is actually short on squares. Nowhere to go, right? So the best you could do is maybe taking a pawn on your way out somehow. I'm not even sure which would be.
And then we can also go to d5,
Yeah, knight d5 would be interesting. But you did end up losing this this piece here. So definitely not ideal. Maybe knight b4. So better than bishop e7. Any ideas? How can we defend this knight? Not bishop takes b6, not bishop b7.
Bishop d6.
Simply bishop d6. And there's no way to attack this guy again. There's actually no way to attack this guy again, Because like I said, black's pieces are awkward, he doesn't have a lot of space, and he's not developed. So bishop d6 would have been easily winning for white. White would then probably continue with something like e5, opening up this bishop on this diagonal, and things would be nice. But in the game, white actually fell for it. He actually took on b6. And Jonathan played rook b7, white played knight a8, and then Jonathan played f6. So this was very strange to see, right? But this is actually not a completely uncommon thing to see in games around this level, is people try to do a trick, and then they get like halfway through it, and they're like, oh, I guess maybe it's not working. But the thing is, you really, really have to have alarm bells going off in your head when you get to a position like this. When you see pieces placed on such really absurd squares that they shouldn't be on, and so underdefended, like both of these pieces like have nowhere to go. And so there has to be a tactic there. There almost has to be. It's kind of crazy if there isn't. So that's when you really need to take your time, spend your time on this move, find the best move. So yeah, we went over it a second ago. It's just rook to b8, attacking both pieces.
Okay.
Yeah, and if the knight moves, we can take this bishop. If the bishop tries to run away, obviously, we can take this knight. So there's just nothing for white to do. And black would actually probably be maybe slightly better. That being said, f6 here. And now this was really kind of the end of the game. White simply extracts his bishop and extracts his knight. And there's not much left for black to try. All right, we see knight takes c8 happen, rook takes c8. So this is a good idea from white, simply trading off black's piece, which was threatening to activate, for his piece, which, like we said, it looks nice on b6, but maybe it's slightly overextended. Maybe it's going to be the victim of some tactics if white's not careful. We see bishop takes e7. Again, white's just trying to trade down, which is totally fine. King e7, c3, knight a5, bishop f1, knight c4. So this move is a little bit strange from Jonathan. You never want to trade down when you're behind on material, especially in an online game like this where anything can kind of happen. So I thought it would have made a lot more sense just to play rook b6, just to be a practical player, keep this knight on the board, aimed kind of at this king side here. But instead, we saw knight c4, and this simply brings white closer to an easier endgame to win. Rook e1, king e6. I'll just play through these moves because they don't matter as much. And now we reached this position. So just off the top of your head, what do you think are some potential tactics here? This is another way to kind of recognize tactics, is to notice the placement of pieces and to use those patterns that you've seen before to recognize some tactics that are potential. They don't work just yet, but maybe someday down the road you should keep your eye out for something like this happening. It's kind of a vague description I gave, but which of these pieces look like they might be won through some kind of basic tactic that we know? Either a pin, some kind of double attack, some kind of, skewer. Do any of those ring a bell here with the way black's pieces are placed?
So white has to use a tactic, right?
So yeah, he might not have a tactic yet, but we're looking for potential tactics in the position.
I think he can fold with the knight.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Black should notice, hey, these two pieces are kind of lined up awkwardly, right? I've seen this pattern before. The knight's threatening to come into c5. So that's something to be aware of in your games. There are many ways to find tactics in your games to recognize tactics, but noticing when your pieces are kind of awkwardly placed is a big part of it. So I would have loved to see a move like rook to c7 here. Simply adding a defender to this square, stepping out of this potential fork. You're stepping into, of course, another potential fork if a knight were to land on d5, but of course the knight is pretty far away from hitting that square. Instead, Jonathan played this move, which of course, now what can white play? What's the finishing blow here?
Okay. I think he prevented the fork at least. But he can take the bishop with the rook.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just removing this defender of the c5 square, and then this fork ends the game, right? white wins a piece to go with the 2 pawns he was already up. So a lot of things went wrong for Jonathan this game, right? So to recap, he was unfamiliar with the opening, which sometimes that just happens in chess. You're not going to know every opening all the time, but that's when you need to fall back on opening principles, right? You don't want to be playing these unnatural looking moves if you're really not sure what's going on, with making weaknesses and not developing your pieces, just kind of pushing a lot of pawns and not getting developed. That's mistake number 1. Let's see, mistake number 2 was, not being prepared for the center to open up. That kind of goes with what I was saying. So let's see, we're here in this game now with d6 and bishop g7. That's kind of where he was actually in a losing position. And then allowing all this, he was kind of forced into it actually by his opening choices. But then especially here, he did well to find b6, a clever way to take advantage of white's 2 underdefended pieces. But then not realizing that he should have a tactic here and taking his time to find the tactic. That was kind of mistake number 2. I think mistake number 3, which was hard to avoid, was letting all these pieces get traded off. And then mistake number 4 was playing, of course, this bishop d6 move, but more specifically, not being aware of the potential tactics in the position. And so this is kind of critical, not only when you're in a losing position, but when you're in a winning any type of position. You have to be aware of the potential tactics. Even if they don't work yet, they might work later. So you got to be on the lookout for those.
It might have been like he might have moved his rook to C2. That would be better, right?
So yeah, that's the move I suggested, was this rook c7 move. Stepping out of this fork and keeping an eye on this potential square for the knight to move up to. So definitely a lot of things for Jonathan to work on there. So if you're watching Jonathan, take a look at some of these ideas. Maybe it'll help you improve a little bit before our match. That being said, though, we can't be too hard on the guy. This was an internet game. So let's look at a game he played where he was fighting hard. He was tied for first place. This was actually the Chess Club Staff Championship. It's not the most recent one we had, but it is the one where he played the toughest competition in Tony Rich, who helps organize all of our big events, big US championship events, and helps run the club. Tony's no slouch. He's over 2,000, I think, so he doesn't need this class. But we're going to be taking a look at what separated him from Jonathan in this game. So this was a USCF rated event. Jonathan was giving it his all. I think he was fighting for a big prize like a comp day or something, so definitely something he cares about. So definitely no excuses here. He was giving it his all, but let's see what still went wrong for him. We saw d4, c4, d5, and this is a Benko gambit. So this is all theory, which I'm sure Jonathan and Tony both knew. Let me just reach kind of the starting tab here. So after queen b6, we kind of find the first real place where white can branch off in this a4 line specifically in the Benko. So how many of you are familiar with the Benko gambit? Know a little bit about it? Yep. So what's the basic idea? So of course, white is up a pawn here if you do a quick count, but what does black get in exchange for it? So what type of positional advantage? Yeah, it's these queenside files. That's where black gets his play from, right? White's up a pawn, but he's going to find it hard to use his extra pawn as it's on this side of the board. And black's pieces are all going to be kind of placed to try and attack these pawns, try and break through and win them back. So that's kind of the type of game you should be expecting in the Benko gambit, which I'm sure Jonathan was aware of. He used less than 30 seconds to get to this position. Thanks to the wonder of DGT boards, we have all this info. We saw rook to a3. So this isn't actually the main line. I'm not sure if Jonathan had this special line prepped for this match or not, but it is a perfectly fine move. What do you think the idea is, first off? It looks kind of strange, right? It's not a normal opening move that you would see. Yeah, so it protects this knight, and the idea is that you want to advance this pawn, but protecting this knight wasn't what white needed to do to advance the pawn, actually. So the idea is more it gets this rook on a safer square. So one common tactic that you find in the Benko gambit, let's just play some moves here. And let's say white plays like rook e1 here for some reason. A lot of these are nonsense moves, but don't worry about it. But one common tactic is there has a pin on this a pawn. And white wants to put his knight on b5, but sometimes he falls victim to this type of tactic, right? So that's one advantage of putting the rook on a3, is after something like knight b5, the rook is defended. A big second advantage to this is it steps off this diagonal of this bishop, okay? So we've seen this before when you suggested b6 in the first game. You might fall victim to some tactics because these sneaky bishops that get fianchettoed, they can often come to life and attack things that are hidden along the diagonal. So rook a3 is kind of a multi-purpose move. We saw rook b8 from black, which makes a lot of sense. He's playing simply, putting his rooks on the open files. Queen c2 from white, stepping off the back rank, defending this pawn, defending this pawn, defending this knight, a very decent move. Queen to b4, activating his queen. We see rook to e1, adding another defender to this weak pawn. Knight g4. So of course the idea here is he wants to reroute this knight to e5 and aim at some critical squares in white's camp. And now we see knight b5, the move white has been trying to play. It helps kind of block off these two rooks here by shoving this knight in the way. It also aims at some slightly uncomfortable squares for black if he's not careful. We saw knight b6, aiming at this pawn, also aiming at this square. b3. And now what do you think black should play? What has black been playing for? Because if he's not careful, a bishop d2 move will come in quite handy for white. And it's going to hurt black quite a lot when he figures out this queen has no squares. So you want to solve this problem and find a way to break down these pawns so you can continue attacking them. So someone in the YouTube chat is wondering if the 12a4 variation, so this variation, is still considered better for white. And I think the latest I've heard is that this is really the line that makes black players uncomfortable when playing the Benko, is this a4 stuff. So I'm not sure if it's objectively better still, but it does give black some discomfort. But yeah, so any ideas from you guys for black? What moves were you thinking about? You got anything? Yeah.
Knight takes a4.
Well, yeah, so knight a4. Unfortunately, this move isn't quite playable because this pawn does come back to defend this knight. And again, because of this nice rook a3 move, this line wouldn't actually be great for black because we have this bishop to defend our stuff. And at the end of the day, we end up in exchange. So again, that rook a3 move coming in handy against these tactics with this bishop being nicely placed. But that was a good idea. You definitely want to weaken these two pawns somehow.
C4.
So yeah, c4 is the right idea. I see some people in the YouTube chat got it. So c4, trying to break down these pawns. So now, how do we want to respond to this as white? As white, you see, I'm definitely in some danger here. He's really breaking down my stuff. What can I do? There are a few options for white.
What about bishop d2?
So yeah, bishop d2 is a good move. It's what Jonathan actually played in the game. But the thing you have to realize, which obviously it's difficult when you're just attending a lecture to do this, but in an over-the-board game where you're fighting hard, you definitely want this comp day. You're fighting your boss. You want to beat him up in this chess game. What you do when you enter bishop d2, this is something you should realize, is you enter a tactical variation, right? So what I mean by that is black has attacked one of your pieces. He's threatened to take it. And what you've done is not resolved the situation. What you've done is made the situation more complicated by putting one of black's pieces under attack, but not protecting your own. So what you do when you enter a variation like this is you've got to calculate through to the end. So what do you think I mean by the end? Where does a tactical variation end if it starts when, you know, pieces are under attack? Sorry, what was that? So yeah.
One move after you finish exchanging pieces.
So yeah, one move after you finish exchanging pieces is it's a good way to put it. It's not quite the phrasing I would have used. What idea did you have in mind? When you stop exchanging pieces? Okay, so the way I like to put it is the line is over when no threats are being made anymore. So what do I mean by that? So let's say, you know, this is a threat and this is a threat. So let's say black were to play queen c5 here, white were to take here, black were to take here. All right, I move out of the way. We're not quite done yet because this is still a threat, so we have to think about this move. And we have to think about one more move for black if he has any more threats here. For example, queen f2 I missed, which is a problem. So OK, so let's say queen c5. Now white has to deal with this threat. So let's say bishop f4. And then let's say the line continues, takes, takes. OK, I keep blundering. See, things are hard, so you have to be thinking about all these lines. But all right, let's say c takes b3 happens, bishop takes b4 happens, b takes c2 happens. Now black still has a threat, so you have to find a move for white here, and you can't do it, right? So this line wouldn't work. But you see how things are suddenly becoming very concrete. So that's why you have to think all the way through to the end before you enter a tactical variation. So what happened in the game was black played the most natural move, c takes b3. So we just saw the bishop takes b4 isn't a very good move. I went through that pretty quickly, but definitely not a great move because black can take here and advance his pawn further up the board. So what do you think white wants to do instead? Any ideas? So yeah, this move isn't so good because you have this threat on this pawn, and this pawn has survived, and bishop b2 is threatened. Queening is going to be happening, so you don't like that line as white. But you've had to see this coming in your head from bishop d2, right? Because you've entered the variation, there's no turning back.
How about rook b1?
Rook b1, it's going to be a similar situation. Now you can take this back with the rook if you want, but let's see. There's a knight takes a4 maybe. Could be problematic, or a rook takes a4. So you want to move the queen? Well, where do you move the queen? Oh, not quite b2. b1? So all right, so you see this line in your head. You see, OK, bishop d2, c takes b3, queen b1. Do you stop calculating there, or is there still more to do? There's more to calculate, right? Because you still have threats in the position. So let's try to do this in our head now without putting it on the board. So bishop d2, c takes b3, queen to b1. Black has to move his queen. So where does black move the queen? Or deal with the threat, not necessarily move the queen. c5? I think I heard. So yeah, the black queen goes to c5. Are you done calculating now, or is there more to calculate?
Now the queen's attacking f2 again.
Yeah. Now we see this idea where the queen is attacking f2. So there's still more to calculate. So how do we want to deal with the threat on f2 after queen b1, queen c5? Is there a convenient way? So you can play rook e2, but then again we run into this same problem, right? Where black still has threats. He still has threats on a4 as well. So we need to find some way to not allow all these threats in our calculations. So bishop d2, c takes b3. We need to put our queen somewhere that kind of stops all these threats from the black side. So what's been the big problem in a lot of these lines? What has white had to kind of deal with uncomfortably? The rook on a8. So yeah, this a4 pawn has been a problem. But what's been the other problem? It's been this queen on c5, right? Attacking this f2 pawn. It's kind of been granting black this extra tempo that we need to kind of consolidate our position. So we want to find some way to stop this queen from getting to f2. So let's put this on the board. So how can we stop this queen from attacking f2? Other than taking it, because we've seen that taking it doesn't quite work. We need an extra tempo somehow. So yeah, the people in the YouTube chat have some good ideas. What'd you say?
Rook takes b3.
So rook b3 is a good idea. Maybe queen takes a4. And so yeah, we have even material now, but this would definitely be better than I think what we were looking at a second ago, especially with some knight c7 stuff. This is an interesting idea. Maybe there's some problems involving, let's see. Yeah, maybe rook b3 isn't a terrible idea. Yeah, rook b3 and queen b3 I think are both fine for white. There's one other idea, though, which I want to take from the YouTube chat. This was the line that appealed to me the most, which is queen c6. And so now the idea is you are still attacking this queen, so black has something to deal with. This c5 is still the only square, but now you can deal with this threat with tempo by capturing the queen and then capturing on b3. So this is the way I might have tried to deal with it if I were playing in Jonathan's shoes. We still lose this pawn, but now we've given black this weakness, and this pin isn't so relevant because we can break the pin with rook b1. Maybe if c4, we see this rook b4 idea. And it would just be an endgame now, where I think I would slightly prefer white, because I think this pawn's going to end up being a weakness rather than a strength on c4. With that in mind, the point of this all, which was to kind of introduce you to calculating. Calculating is one of the hardest parts of chess. Calculating correctly is even harder. But the way you want to do it is you want to go through to the end until there's no more threats and evaluate there. So you can't evaluate this position. There's no evaluation you can give to this position because things are still hanging. Things still have to be moved. You don't know what's going to happen. You have to get to the position where there's either no more threats or your opponent has too many threats for you to deal with. So that can be tough in over-the-board games. But it's definitely how you need to approach calculating is, okay, I need to get to the end of the line. And so what I would recommend to Jonathan is to start doing that in his games because he played queen to d1, which runs into a similar problem after queen to c5. Now he simply has to deal with this threat on this f2 pawn. So he plays queen to e2. But now he hasn't had time to recapture this b pawn. And after pawn to b2, it's actually going to be sticking around for a while with the support of this bishop. And so already white is actually completely lost here. This b2 pawn is simply too strong. The game continued with h3, kicking this knight away from this f2 pawn. Knight to c4. So again, another intermezzo here. Rook to b3, knight e5. And this part of the game isn't as relevant, although I did want to mention something here. So we talked about this briefly in the first game, but it's about putting up resistance when you're losing. So let's say you're playing as black, or playing as black. Would you rather play against the guy who goes knight e5, bishop e5, bishop c3, bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, or would you rather play against the guy who goes knight to d4? And let's not go any further. Just against the guy who trades off two sets of pieces or against the guy who doesn't. Who do you want to be playing against if you have black here? So that's option number 1. Option number 2. Yeah, you'd rather be playing against this, right?
Yeah.
More pieces are off the board. There's less for you to worry about.
Because always if the person is not trading, then has a very evil plan.
So yeah, it's difficult to come up with a winning plan or to, conclusively end the game, to, stop all counterplay, end the game when there's a lot of pieces on the board, right? When your opponent has more pieces, then he has more chances to create his own threats. Whereas the more pieces that get taken off the board, the less chances to create threats he has. So that's actually a pretty huge mistake from Jonathan here, is trading off these two sets of pieces. Something like knight to d4 poses actually a lot more problems for black to deal with. It keeps things complicated. For example, the game might have continued something like, let's see here. So in my analysis, I actually threw in bishop b4, which is another interesting move, forces this queen away, so queen b6, and now knight to d4. And let's see how the game might have continued. Something like rook takes a4 makes a lot of sense, right? Picking up a free pawn. Bishop c3 makes a lot of sense for white, putting this rook opposite this queen. Already we see more threats being created, so the queen might have to move again. We see rook to b1 now, and after something like knight to d7, already white is picking up this pawn. And at the end of the day, the tactics work out slightly in black's favor, and he gets to pick up this e4 pawn. But this is definitely an interesting endgame that white can definitely try to hold. By no means is white completely lost here. Whereas we can see what happens in the game later on. But the point I'm trying to prove is you can just create a lot of annoying threats for black to deal with. And then it might seem counterintuitive to say, oh, you can't trade here, but you can trade here. But the difference is, white's getting something in return for it now. White held off on the trade, but in return, he gets to pick up this strong pawn on b2. So that's what I'm saying, is keep pieces on the board until you can, prove something. Or if you can't prove something, then just try to keep creating threats. With that being said, what happened in the game was, of course, knight takes c5, and this trade on c3. And after rook a4, knight a3, rook takes a3, more pieces come off the board. And this queen b5 move is actually slightly inaccurate from Tony, because it does allow this slightly awkward check. And now, black has had to waste some time dealing with this check. Better would have been just queen to b6, when right away this is threatened, and there's really nothing white can try to do about it after something like, let's see, probably just rook a1 here. This would just be game over. But we saw queen b5 from Tony, which allows this check. Now, of course, you can't capture because of queen takes queen. So we see king g7, takes, rook b1. And now Jonathan is stuck trying to hold this endgame with this pawn on b2, rather than this other endgame that we saw where, okay, black's up a pawn, but his extra pawn's on e7, right? You would much rather play that endgame than this endgame. So, white's just completely losing here. I'll play through the moves. This h4 move is a slight inaccuracy, which it probably didn't affect the outcome of this game. But when you're trying to hold like this, you tend to not want to make any more weaknesses, especially in a major piece endgame like this. So h4 is just giving up slightly more squares to the opponent. So definitely not something you want to do. From the black side, h5 actually makes slightly more sense. I don't want to go into too many details about this endgame, which is clearly just winning for black. But we see king h2 now. And both players kind of just make time for a second. Unfortunately for Jonathan, he makes time in a way that loses. So again, just being aware of potential tactics in the position, noticing the fact that this queen is staring down this diagonal and not stepping into the pin, which is tough to do, especially when you're dead lost like this and you know you're dead lost and you just kind of want to end the game. But it's key to putting up a good fight, is staying in the game, really thinking about it. So after this, the game ended pretty quickly here. We saw e6 finally breaking open this diagonal. And after this, black traded into a winning rook endgame, which was eventually won, believe it or not. Just pushed his pawns up the board, and here Jonathan resigned. So that's already been a lot we've gone over, but what are some key points that I've made? Try to refresh them in your head. So yeah, calculate to the end. And the end means when there are no more obvious threats in the position, or even subtle threats. You don't want those either.
You're trying to hold when you're losing a position. Trying to create more threats.
Yeah, try to create more threats, keep more pieces on. Like, these are things I'm sure Jonathan has heard before. But the other part of it, which I'll get into a bit later, is applying them at the board. But okay, so keeping pieces on the board to create more threats. I'm ready for you to calculate through to the end. In this first game especially, when you're unfamiliar with the opening, you want to fall back on principles. You don't want to make a lot of weaknesses. Let's see. Yeah, a lot of weaknesses with stuff like this and not developing your pieces. Later on in this game, we saw, noticing when pieces are underdefended or overextended, which I taught a whole lecture on this. That's when tactics show up. That's when you really need to look for tactics. That's when Jonathan should have found this rook b8. And then, lastly, noticing when pieces are awkwardly placed to step into tactics. These are all things that Jonathan is doing wrong in these games, and some of them are, popping up more frequently. But what I want to talk about, which is what I think Jonathan's problem is, which is what I think a lot of players' problem is, I think everybody struggles with this. It has to deal with this guy's username, lazy youth. So what happens to a lot of players is laziness. It's a big problem. It's a huge problem that people face. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean not wanting to study, not wanting to come out to classes. I mean when you're actually sitting there at the board playing the game, you get lazy. It just happens, right? You're there for hours and hours and hours, and you get bored, you get a little lazy, and you're like, okay, I know these principles, I know I should calculate through to the ends, but you just don't want to sometimes, right? It's tough to do this on every move, to be saying, okay, where are my pieces? Are they where they need to be? Are there any tactics I'm missing? All right, does this variation actually end here? It's just laziness that crops up, which is extremely difficult to combat, actually. But it's just something, the only advice I can give for it is being aware that it exists, being aware when you're doing it, being aware, okay, wait, I didn't actually think about this move as much as I should have. It's tough to apply that much mental effort on every turn, but it's something to keep in mind that is a legitimate problem that I think everyone deals with. And it's not something like to be ashamed about. It's not something like, oh, I'm lazy at the board or anything. It's something that just, it occurs, and it's something you have to keep in mind. With that in mind, let's take a quick look at this last game. I think we still have some time left. So we saw d4, d5, c4, c6. And it was a Slav defense. And so it transposed into kind of an exchange Slav here. But it's an exchange Slav where black has had to fianchetto this bishop. So it's not an ideal exchange Slav, because this bishop really doesn't want to be looking at this pawn. We see h3 from white, giving this bishop a square to retreat to. Knight c6, bishop b2, b6, rook c1, bishop b7, castles, rook c8, queen b3, knight a5, queen a4, and some more moves. And now knight to c4. So this is the first big point I want to talk to. So what is going on in this position? First of all, the first thing to notice is, both players are well developed, both players are castled, the opening is kind of over, there's no real problems there, there's no huge pawn breaks that either player is threatening just yet. So it's going to be mostly about piece placement and weaknesses. So whose pieces are placed better? What do you think? White or black? Black. Why do you say that?
I mean, black is more spread over the board. Actually, white is also.
Yeah, both players are kind of, they're controlling a lot of the board. It's kind of a full board game.
Yeah, but I think black just like the black castle, because it just you have that bishop.
Sure.
Longest diagonal.
So as far as king safety, I'd say both kings are, almost completely safe, but I would definitely say black has a very safe king. I think that's what you're trying to say. But as far as piece placement, I would actually prefer the white pieces here. And the reason for that has to do with these two bishops, first of all. This bishop staring at this pawn, which for the moment, it's not obvious what purpose it's actually going to serve, besides maybe defending the king, but I think the king is already pretty safe. And then this bishop is kind of staring at his own pawns. It's not doing much. It is serving an important purpose, controlling this square, but that's kind of all it's doing. Yeah, if the board opens up, though, right? You have to find a way to open up the board for those bishops to come to life. Whereas for white's bishops, this bishop is on a pretty nice diagonal. It's stuck behind this knight, but this knight's pretty mobile, right? It has places to go. This bishop isn't great, but it controls some key squares here, and it controls this knight outpost. As far as the major pieces, these are all pretty well evenly matched, I would say, considering they're all opposing each other in a symmetrical pawn structure. And then as far as the knights, this knight and this knight are kind of canceling each other out, right? This knight wants to come to e4, this knight prevents it. And then this knight and this knight. So this knight on c4 looks pretty strong, right? And this knight on e5 looks pretty strong, but the thing is they're kind of in contact right now. So I would say, you know, the knights are also pretty well placed for both sides. But there's a key difference. And the key difference comes from the weaknesses both players have made. So what do you think are some pretty key weak squares in Black's camp? The knight is occupying one of them on e5. Other key weaknesses.
C5 square.
Definitely the c5 square. This is the major weakness I want to talk about. Because both of these pawns have been pushed, so neither can ever control the c5 square, right? And, you know, White eventually might play b4 to even further solidify this, but he hasn't as of yet, which is very, very important for White's position. Because this knight looks very nice here, but because White hasn't made as many weaknesses, he has an extra option that Black doesn't have. So what's that extra option that White has here?
You can move knight to d3.
So yeah, he can play knight d3, and let's say, I don't know, Black makes some nothing move, but then the important thing is White has an extra option now.
Place it on c4.
So yeah, he can put it on c5, but Black also had this option. White's extra option has to deal with the weaknesses that he hasn't yet made. So he hasn't pushed this pawn forward, so he hasn't fully weakened this c4 square. So what can he do?
Push the pawn.
Yeah, he can play b3. And then suddenly this awesome knight is running a little short on squares. It has to kind of retreat, right? And now, you know, we see maybe White's knight come up and go to this very excellent square, putting pressure on this weak bishop. So this would have been very nice for White, is using his advantage here, his advantage where he can come into this square, but he can still kick his opponent out of this square. That's actually kind of the only advantage White has. Another advantage that I did talk about is this bishop being better than this bishop, but that's kind of a very slight thing. The big thing here is Black doesn't have b6 and White has b3, as someone in the YouTube chat has said. With that in mind, what do you think about this move from White, playing b3 right away? Looks good? So it's actually not my favorite move. It gives away a lot of White's advantage. What's the reason for that? What does Black have here?
Black can come on
Knight b2.
Knight b2.
no, knight
Yeah.
a3.
This knight doesn't have many squares, right? Knight a3 is another option, but this knight would also get kind of stuck over here. Maybe just something like queen to d2, aiming for this square, and then already this knight's not actually doing a whole lot on the side of the board.
You take the knights off the board.
So yeah, you can just take these knights off the board, right? And this is what Black did in the game. And now all of a sudden, yes, you have control over this square, but now you've lost your piece that you're going to put on that square. So the square is no longer really doing anything for White. There's no way to use it. Which is why we had to play this knight d3 move that you, Satya, actually suggested first off, in order to aim at this square and prevent this knight from coming off the board. So it's a very key thing to recognize in your games is, you know, when you haven't made these weaknesses, you definitely, that's always a good thing, but you definitely need to have a way to use them. So Jonathan actually just gave up his way to use this square here, which kind of gave away his advantage. And all right, at this moment, it's 6:54. So if you guys are playing in the nights, I would recommend heading over there and getting ready for your game, because you know, don't want to be late. But thank you guys for coming out. I'm going to wrap up this game in the next 5 minutes. But yeah, you guys are welcome to head over if you want. OK, moving on from there, though, we saw knight e4, knight takes e4, and more piece trades. Whoops. Catch back up to the game here. All right, more piece trades. And now, actually, since there's no point to controlling this square anymore, White actually does just play b4, giving up, you know, any hope he had of claiming an advantage. And now Black plays e5, rook to d1, rook to d8, rook to c5. And this is actually already falling into some danger because, unfortunately for Jonathan, at the end of the day, you get into this endgame, and now black has this nice move, activating his rook before activating white's rook, and he will win a pawn. And the game continues like this, and actually black goes on to win this rook endgame, which was something else I could talk about if I had more time, but I think we've covered quite a lot for today, and so I just want to do a quick recap instead of going into the details of this specific endgame. So any questions you had overall about anything I was doing today? Did it all kind of make some sense? A lot of it was kind of complicated stuff, but so yeah, what are my tips for Jonathan overall, I guess is the question. And so Jonathan, if you're watching this, if you're listening, I would definitely say, when you do find yourself in unfamiliar territory in the opening, which doesn't happen to a guy like you very often, because he's of Chess Openings Explained fame, but when it does happen, you definitely want to fall back on those principles. Don't break so many principles next time, and be cautious in openings where you're unfamiliar. The next big thing is when you're losing, definitely be aware of that and try to keep pieces on the board. Try to create those threats. I know this is something you already know, but you've got to apply it at the board. Third of all, you've got to start calculating through to the end until there's no more threats on the board and you're certain that the position has kind of resolved. That's when you're allowed to stop calculating. And lastly, be aware of your positional advantages, your weak squares, and make sure you have a way to use them. Don't throw away your pieces that you were going to use to occupy those weak squares. And last but not least, don't be lazy at the board when you show up to our match. I'm going to be ready to play. I'm going to be full throttle, and I expect you to do the same. With that in mind, thank you all for watching. Thank you for joining me here. This has been the Road to 2000, specifically targeted at getting Jonathan Schrantz to that expert level for our match. And I will see you next time.